Oh, I'm live. I should probably get off Twitch. Heyo. Looks like the show is on. And we should probably kick off with where we left off last time. So I've got this project going on over here. We've got some HTML, got a form that we're working on. I'm going to open that in my console and run npm run dev to get my Fastify server up and running. So I go back to my browser and open up my localhost at that port. I can see my form. Cool, it's looking good. So where we left off yesterday was we were progressively enhancing this form so that it would work by default if it, well, just with the HTML standard approach. So if JavaScript is not enabled or blocked by the client, or there's a bad connection or whatever, this form is going to send a post request. Let's see if I can bump that up. Cool. This form is going to send a post request to my /API route. Let's look at the actual HTML. So this form is going to send a post request to my API. And I've got some form inputs here with IDs and names and types and some validation, some Html5 validation attributes. So by default, that form, if I don't fill anything out and I just hit that submit button, that form is not going to submit because HTML is going to say, whoa, this is a required field over here, and you haven't filled it out. So it's going to highlight that required field and show me a little pop-up. And we can see what that looks like. If I, you know what, I'm going to say, I'm going to stop sharing my screen really quick, and I'm going to just install a browser extension. So just hang tight. This one looks good. Add that, add the extension. And then okay, that should be good to go. Let's reload this page. I should have my extension here now. Cool. I want to, can I not drag that up there? I want to pin that. Okay. I can't. But anyway, this is going to enable or disable JavaScript, right? So I think now my JavaScript should be disabled, and we can see that, yes, when I try to submit the form without, oh, yeah, right, you can't see my screen. There we go. Okay, so now I've got my JavaScript toggler extension on. This tells me that JavaScript is on. I click that. It tells me JavaScript is disabled. And I have this form. So when I submit the form, this input is required, but right now it's empty. So when I try to submit, the default browser behavior is to highlight that input and then show me that little error message. And we're going to see what we have cooking when JavaScript is enabled. When JavaScript is enabled, we actually tell the form, use JavaScript to find this form and add the no validate attribute. And the reason why we do that is because we don't want that default behavior to trigger. Instead, we'll use some JavaScript to do the validation work. So when we click submit form, we still get that that highlighting the first invalid input. And we've also added some features that on the blur event, it's going to show the validation errors. So theoretically, if a user comes to this form, they're going to, go through the inputs, and then they'll see the validation errors. And then when they submit, we'll highlight that and the validation error will be there. One other feature of these validation errors is that as they're appended to the page, they're also connected to the input by means of the aria described by attribute and the error's ID. And the reason we need that is so that any assistive technology that lands on this input and is focused on it will see that this input is invalid because this aria invalid attribute. So this input is invalid, and the aria description is going to say, yeah, this value is required. So that's where we are right now. Let's look into taking this a bit further. So what we can see, I'm pretty happy with this on blur event that happens. One thing that we may want to do is on key down, we may want to also trigger that validation, but only if the input has been previously focused. Meaning, if I come here and I focus on it and I skip past it, I want to see that validation message appear. But if I come back here and I start typing, obviously, this should have satisfied that required validation check. So I want to trigger that on key down as well, so that this will go away once it's satisfied, instead of waiting for the blur. So let's look at implementing that. We're going, not package lock JSON. We're going to do that in our client.js file. And I think I'll give us a little bit more space there to work with, to look at. And where are we? Right. So we've gone through our inputs and we've added this blur event listener. And that's okay. But we also want to essentially add the exact same event on the input event, right? So we could copy and paste that, but instead of doing that, I think what I'm going to do is actually, before I get into that, I'm going to add one little thing here. I've got some stylistic things that I don't really love, and I don't want to manually fix. So I want my editor to fix those for me automatically. So I'm going to go into my project root, drop a .eslint rc.cjs file, and paste in this configuration that I've been essentially dragging around from project to project. That is also going to require some plugins. So what's my package look like? All right, let's stop that really quick and let's install some of these dependencies that I'm just going to copy paste for the moment. Install dev dependency, that one, and that one, ESLint config prettier, and ESLint plugin JS doc, and ESLint plugin prettier, and ESLint plugin security, and ESLint plugin unicorn. And if you're not familiar with ESLint and these config things and these plugin things, it's kind of hard to explain, but it'll make more sense in a moment once they're installed. So let's give that all that time. Get back into our dev command. Everything's working. Cool. Now let's look at our source code. Yeah, we installed some dependencies, of course. We have that installed. So now, if I open up my client.js file, I feel like this should have had an error. It should have been asking for some parentheses. And it's not. Well, forget it. ESLint is a tool that will help us write JavaScript in a consistent way. And it'll give us little red squigglies or yellow squiggly lines underneath the place where we have errors. So I don't know why it's not doing it. Like all of this should have been an error. I wonder if I have to reload. Oh, here we go. There we go. Okay, cool. ESLint is now kicking in. So it's showing me all these errors. And I wonder if it's because that needs to be like that for that to work. Close that. Need to use that sort of line, end of line sequence. Cool. So now everything should be working as expected. Yes. So if we look at our code here, I can see that functionally speaking, technically speaking, this is working fine. I can test that by hitting Control KS. No. Control KS. No. I guess not. You should be able to save without formatting. But if I were to hit save and rerun this script, it would still work just fine. And we can see that a whole bunch of changes were made here. In fact, it looks like this semicolon was added, which doesn't make a difference in most cases if that semicolon is there. But stylistically, and especially if you're working with a lot of people, you may want to have consistent coding style practices. So ESLint is a tool that will show you that red squiggly if you're breaking any rules. And you can set up VS Code to automatically fix it, whatever can be automatically fixed when you hit save. So that's what that is. Hope that was a good explanation. So let's go back to what we were doing. Was we were going to take this function and pull it into its own function thing, I guess. Put it into a function, a named function. We'll call it validate on blur. The reason why we want to do that is because we want to have two of these event listeners, one for blur and one for input. And I'm calling it validate on blur because that's mostly what it's going to be doing. So let's define that function up here. We're going to say function. Oh, that is very disregard what I just wrote. Function validate on blur, and we can get rid of the arrow, and we can hit save. Cool. That's expecting some sort of event. I want to call that a specific event. It's going to be an event. And that's going to run. No, I don't want this to be validate on blur. I want this to be validate input. And let's see. Oops. Validate input. Validate input is going to, no, validate on blur. That's fine. Cool, cool, cool. All right, so where are we? What validate on blur is going to do, it's going to capture that event target, and then it's going to do the validation. So then when we actually use it, we're going to run this as well on the input event. Now we have a little bit of a tricky situation here because we essentially want to run the same validation logic on the input in two different scenarios. Once when the input receives a blur event, once when the input receives an input event. However, we only want to run it on that input event in the case that the input has already been blurred, meaning it's been focused. Well, we'll just call it in a dirty state. So it's been focused and then the focus has left. That'll be the input is dirty. So how do we do that? Well, validate on blur is going to say, validate on blur is going to say, we're going to capture the event target, and then we're going to say if the event type, what are you trying to tell me, Copilot? The event type equals blur. I don't really want to deal with the input's validity because we do that down here. So I don't need that part. Thank you very much. If the event type is blur, then, well, actually we'll say the event type is an input, right? We want to say if input dot dataset dot is dirty equals true, we're going to return. No. If the input is not, dataset is not dirty. Okay, so in the event of an input event, if the input dataset is not dirty, then we'll return early. Otherwise, we can assume that it's a blur event. And in the event of a blur, we want to say input dot dataset dot is dirty equals true. Okay, I think that should solve that, right? So now we get the blur event, and then here we're going to get, no, we're triggering the input, which is not what we want. So our input here should have, okay, data is dirty is true, which is not what we want. I think I'm missing some logic here. I think we need to check else if the event type is blur. Okay, so let's try reloading this. So the first one, We type, nothing happens. And then we're still typing, but we haven't blurred. Why is that getting the dirty event? It has not blurred yet. Okay, let me see something. Make some sanity checks. Console log event dot type. Event type, what I'm typing should be input. There's something wrong with this. This is basically going to go through and say, this isn't going to trigger. But we should only be making this true if it's a blur event. Okay, let's take a look and see what we got here. Input, 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 input. Delete everything. And some reason we're still triggering that validation logic. Oh. That's because we're still going through all of this. No. It's because we don't stop here on an input. Hold on 1 second. Let's try this another approach. If the event type is blur, then we want to do this, right? And then that makes sense. Okay, so we only want to validate after the input is dirty. Well, let me keep going anyway. Otherwise, if input data set is dirty does not equal true. Oh, there's my problem. No, this is true. This is fine. If not, it's not equal true, then we'll return. Otherwise, we'll continue to validate the input. I think that ought to do it. But I said that before. Okay, now we're typing and we're not getting that error. And when we blur, we do get that error. Cool. And when I go back, I can type again and it fixes. Cool. So now it's fixing every time that it's fixing every time on input only after the first blur event. So that's working right. Now, if I go to my email and then I come back, I can see that the value is required. And if I type, I can see that my second error message of not being an email is updated right away. Yo.co. Cool. We also have a whole bunch of console logs to the console that I want to get rid of. So this was correct. That was fine. And then place errors. Cool. That we don't need anymore. Right on. This is working. Yo, Alex, what is going on? Looks like Alex just joined the chat. Hey, I was on your stream earlier. It was good stuff. Saw you struggling to pick some font families. That's always, I'm surprised you got through that so quickly. That's usually something that takes like 4 hours. Yay! Yeah, I don't know if you've been on this, if you've been watching the stream before, but what we're doing is, well, why don't you tell me? Have you been watching the stream before? Do you know what we're doing? Do I have to go through all that again? Patiently waiting for someone to type. No idea. So this is cool. I think this is cool. We're basically building a form that is progressively enhanced with JavaScript. So the way we do that is, well, we start with a form, right? It's going to submit some data to an API. So the way we do that is defining the API endpoint with action, and then saying that we're going to send the data as post method. And we have some inputs, and some of them are required and have some sort of validation logic, such as minimum value or the type. So that's fun with just HTML. If we do that by default, I'm just going to trigger JavaScript enablement. If we do that by default and we try to submit the form, a couple things happen for validation by HTML, which is it's going to highlight the first input. It's going to show that error message. So two sort of helpful things is it puts the focus, and if this is a really long page, putting the focus on here will like scroll the page to that input, which is great. And then the other thing that it does is like when we correctly submit a form and we hit submit, page reloads and the network request goes to whatever the page action is, and the payload is constructed based on the name of the inputs. So if I go back to my page, or if I go back to my code, we can see that all of the inputs have these names. Name is name, name is email, name is number. It's a little bit different story when we do that with JavaScript, or if we want to progressively enhance it with JavaScript, because obviously the downside here is that with HTML, we have that kind of weird reload of the page where I hit submit and then it like takes me somewhere else. And we can make that a little bit nicer with fetch. So the first thing that we do is sort of capture the data and put it into a fetch request. And then when the form is submitted, like numbers 8, that, and then we submit the form, we don't get that reload. We do get the request going across and the payload looks the same. And there's a little bit of caveats there. So that is like the ideal user experience. We've done some enhancements to the form when JavaScript is enabled. However, what we're still working on now is when we do that through JavaScript alone, a lot of things can be lost. So one is, well, I kind of have to undo all of my code to show you, but we'll walk through it really quick. But one thing that we want to do with HTML to prevent that sort of default ugly validation message is we want to use the no validate HTML attribute so that we actually prevent the validation from running, the HTML validation. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. Is if we disable JavaScript, but we go back to our form and we add that no validate attribute, and we submit the form. This time, we don't see that HTML5 error message pop up, and the result is we accidentally allow our front end to like send bad data, which is something that we don't want to do. So we don't necessarily want to add that in the HTML. I'd say probably ever, because the point of having these validation attributes on here is so that they work. But what we can do is when JavaScript is enabled, where is my thing? There's my thing, enable JavaScript again. When JavaScript is enabled, we can loop over, let's see, we can, there we go. We can loop over all of the form elements on the page, and we can just tack on the no validate attribute. So this way, if JavaScript is enabled, we can progressively enhance and put in our own like sexy validation. And if JavaScript is not enabled or fails for whatever reason, it'll still fall back to HTML built-in validation. The other thing that we want to do is on the submit event handler, we want to prevent an invalid form from submitting. So we can check the validity state of the form on submit. And if it's invalid, we can return early so that the rest of the submission logic doesn't run. And we can also re-implement some of the native browser features of going to that first invalid form control and focusing on it. I'm going to get rid of that, right? So we have an invalid form here. The behavior is going to be find that first invalid field that's not a field set and focus on it. So we'll get that focus attention, and we'll also get like scrolling to it if it's like a really long form. We'll prevent the default behavior of having the browsers, reloading the page and like submitting it. And then we'll exit early from this function if we're in an invalid state. In a valid state, we'll submit that form using this function called JS submit form, which looks like this. It takes the event, which is the submit event. It grabs the form from the event target. It builds a URL object from the form action or the current window location. Again, that's like the default browser behavior is if a form doesn't have an action defined, it will submit to the current URL. We'll construct a form data object and a URL search params object from the form. The form node is used to construct the form data object, and the form data object is used to construct the URL search parameters object. And then we'll create some of the default options that will be used for a fetch request. If the form has the method defined of either get or post, that will go in the method. So if it's not defined, the method will default to get anyway. And then down here in the event of a GET request, we will append the search parameters to the URL object so that when the form is submitted, the data is sent across in the URL search parameters. In the event of a post request, however, we will do a couple things. We'll check if the form enc type is defined as multi-part form data. If it is defined as multi-part form data, we will send the form data in the body of the request. And the reason why we do this check is because using the form data in the body of the request will, by default, set the content type to multi-part form data. And otherwise, we'll send the search parameters object in the body. And the reason is because the search parameters object in the body does not modify the content type. If you're interested in digging more into that, you can watch yesterday's video. And lastly, we prevent the default behavior down at the bottom of all this logic, because if there's ever an error in the up here, we want that, well, we won't get to this step. So if there is an error, we want it to fall back to the default browser behavior. Otherwise, if we've gotten this far, we can assume that there's been no errors and we've prevent the default behavior, and we just return the fetch of that URL object with that options object. That's kind of where we got to the first day. And then we started creating this validation logic yesterday. And I'm just going to kind of power through this now. What the validation logic does is our JavaScript will take this input as it is. Right now, it only takes the HTML. We can see over here just has like an ID and a name. And actually, I'm even going to remove that ID. I'm going to say in HTML, all we have to begin with is, the label, the name, which is how we want to send the data anyway, and that this field is required. And when we have JavaScript running, if I tab through this form, I can see that nothing's changed so far in my HTML. And when I tab out of it, my validation logic runs. And what we get is the input suddenly has some more attributes added to it. One, it gets a data attribute telling me that it's dirty, meaning it's been touched, which sounds terrible. It's dirty, meaning that something, like, it's received focus and lost focus. So it's like been touched, like dirty with a dirty fingerprint. The other thing is we have an ID that was appended to it. The reason why we want the ID is, well, to build out the rest of it'll make sense in a moment. We also add an aria described by attribute, which points to another element that was appended to the DOM. And this element has an ID which it correlates to the input's ID. And this relationship between aria described by and this ID means that when assistive technology focuses on this input, again, it will let the assistive technology know that, well, the description, it'll read it to the user or whatever. We also add a little aria invalid attribute so that assistive technology knows, hey, this input, there's actually something wrong with it. So if I try to submit the form again, now I can see that, my input has received focus. Theoretically, the assistive technology would be notified that this input is invalid, and it would say, hey, this is the information you have, that this value is missing. Today we went a little bit further and also added that when I want to run this validation logic is based on, I want to be able to type into it and then delete and not have my validation logic run until I've exited from this input. And when I go back, I can type into it and then it live updates the status as I'm typing. Okay. I think that's pretty good. So here on the email one, we have like, oh, don't do that. Here we have, like, as I'm typing, this is live updating, and I can see until the point that I have a valid email, then it's showing me that error or not showing me that error. Cool. All right. Alex, looks like you just kept on saying nice things about what I'm coding, so that's good. I got the pass. Feel good about that. What's the next thing we're going to move into is, right, there is, let's see, we have this validate on blur, which runs on blur and on input, and the reason is because of that sort of dirty checking logic up here. The last thing I want to do, I think, is I basically want to show the user error. There's one use case that we haven't accounted for, and that's a user gets to the form and doesn't go through and go through each of the elements. and they just click submit form, we're still not showing an error message in this case. So what I need to do there is I need to also validate my inputs on submit. So where we have the logic down here, where we say we check for the validity state, we also want to do a little bit of logic and say, I want to say for const input of form. Yeah, look at that. GitHub Copilot helping me out for the win. So what we want to do is loop over all of the inputs in our form, and we basically want to enable that showing that validation logic. So we say input dot dataset dot is dirty is true, because remember, this is the thing that was determining whether we show or hide, well, I guess whether we show the validation logic or not. So we want to set that to true, and then we want to validate the input. Right. So this function doesn't exist. And the reason why I'm pulling this into a different function is because I could say validate on blur, but I don't actually have like an event going. And in order to, I could use a synthetic event where I create a custom event, but the logic is saying, hey, I'm going to go to all of the inputs, and then I'm going to add the dataset attribute is dirty. And I don't also want to trigger a blur event for all of them because I don't know. I guess you could, but I don't think I really want to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is actually wrap up the explicit validation logic, which is basically from here on out, right? This is the part where we're checking whether we can validate. And then this is the part that actually does all of the validation. So let's pull that out. And we're going to say down here, validate input. Cool. And we have that input there. And then we're going to have another function up here called validate input, which takes an input and runs all of that logic. So it's complaining at me because it doesn't know what this input is, right? Because right now this input is any. So we just have to tell it this parameter is an HTML input element. And with there, we have type checking in place. I'm getting a red squiggly here because this is saying, hey, you shouldn't use get element by ID, and I don't really care about that. I still don't know. Okay, now it's just complaining that I should use the structured variables over properties. That's not an error I really care about. Inner text, I should use text content over inner text. That probably actually is relevant. And that looks pretty good. So now we can go back. Alex, by the way, if you're still around, if you have any questions or anything, throw them in the chat. This is not necessarily me doing a lesson or anything. This is me just running through live coding some stuff on my free time. So let's see if this is working. So in theory, once I click this submit form, the event handler, when I click submit form, the event handler for the submit event, cool, should check the validity state. And because I know right now the form is invalid, we should be going through each of our inputs in that form and setting the dirty state to true, which I think doesn't actually matter to run this function because now we're running it anyway, and this function doesn't care about the dirty state. But we do want that dirty state to be set, because then when someone goes back and highlights the first element, we want that live editing or that live updates for the errors. So yeah, that should validate the input, and then it should also go on and find that first invalid input and focus on it, which should more or less imitate the browser behavior, and in my opinion be even better, because the browser only shows when there is an error, but we can actually show on blur events as well. So submit form. Cool. We can see all of our errors popped up, which is great. All of them are connected to the input that they're related to via the ARIA described by. This might be a little bit weird, is like the radio buttons, but that's something for another episode or another series where we do a little bit more of the styling or whatever. But I can say my name is Austin, and as we type that, our errors go away. My email is, I don't know, me@ilovenugget.com. We want to put a number, so we'll put the number 3, and then that's going to tell us, whoa, that value is too small. The minimum is 5. So we'll put 5. And then one of these values is required. What's my favorite operating system? Probably Linux. And this is a weird UI, because we have the label for Linux, then the input, and then after the input is the error, but then we have the label text. So that's a little bit weird. Not something that we need to worry about today. Cool. We also have a little issue here where this should now be satisfied. All of these should be satisfied. So there's a little bit of lost logic there, where these inputs are connected or related to each other by means of the name as far as radio inputs go. What up, Web Dev Journey? Good to have you back. We're just finishing up. I'll do a little recap in a moment. But yeah, all the validation logic should be there, and then we submit the form because it's valid. We do see that network request, and we do see the payload. So that's awesome. I don't know if you were around Web Dev Journey, but a little recap of what I just completed was we did some logic. Well, we had some errors. We had some issues with, I'm just going to like Control Z, I think. Yeah, let's do that. Should be able to go all the way back. Hit save. Oh, shoot. That may not have been a good idea. Oh, that was a really bad idea. No. Because I hit save, it made new changes with the formatter, which means that... No. Did I copy it? No, I didn't. Oh, no. I should have just made you watch the YouTube recap. Just kidding. Well, anyway, the issues that we had were when we submit the form, we had this problem where our form was going to the first invalid input, but then the user wouldn't know what was invalid about it. So that's really painful. I'm going to have to rewrite a lot of that. All right, well, let's do it, I guess, really quick in the 10 minutes that I have. Function validate input was one thing. Input, that did something. And then function validate on blur was another, and that took an event. And if I hit save, that's going to do that for me. Cool. This is an HTML input element. This is an event. And then I know, I had to get down here, right? So we had something like if event.type equals blur, we're going to say, well, this I think actually has to be down here. We're going to say input.dataset.is dirty equals true. And then we're going to say if not input.dataset is dirty, we're going to just return. So the logic here is we basically, only on blur events do we actually want to mark that this is dirty, and only once it's dirty do we want to run our validation logic. Cool. So then we take all this out and we move that into the validate input. No, into the validate input function. I don't know why you're complaining. I did something wrong. Okay, I did something wrong. Copied too far. Here, that should be it. Yep, okay, cool. So validate input, we're going to move that there. Validate on blur is going to be a method where we basically copy this logic out. Date on blur. Put that logic in here. We don't need that top part. I think that's not good. Right, that's it. Okay, cool. We have something wrong with our line endings. And then validate on blur is going to say validate input with the input. And the reason why we refactored all of this is because we basically want to run this validation on blur and on input. And this will only trigger once it has blurred. Validate on blur is a terrible name. Validate on event. There you go. So reload that. Cool. Cool. Yeah. So now it's actually validating as I type and update things. And now the last thing is that form logic of on an invalid form, we say for const input of form query selector all of the input tags that we want. And then we're going to say input.dataset is dirty is true so that it can validate. I guess so that it can validate next time or as we type into it. And then we're going to run the validation input to show the validation error messages. So on submit now, I should see all of the error messages. Boom. And it should highlight the first one. And I should now see what my error is. And as I type, it should fix that error. Cool. That is not an email. You're right. That is a number. but number 2 is too small, but that's big enough. Favorite OS is Windows, and this is the only one that has a problem now. Cool. So then we can submit the form. API request goes along. We see the payload. Everything's working. All right. That was fast. That was like 5 minutes to get all of that back, I think. I'm not going to make that error again. Cool. I think that's probably all the time I have for today. I think maybe tomorrow we might look at fixing, well, yeah, we might look at fixing the radio inputs. I might try throwing in like a bunch of different types of inputs so that we can see that our validation logic is working. But that was the idea, enhancing HTML forms so that none of the default behavior is lost and it's only made better with JavaScript. And we can see it's not that much JavaScript, like 110 lines with, you know, a generous amount of spacing, some comments. Like if we minified this would be actually pretty small. So I'm pretty happy with that. Anyone got questions? Otherwise, I'm going to take off and hang out with Nugget. No? No? Is anyone even there anymore? Yes, I can see that there's someone there. Yeah, thanks for the cast. You're welcome anytime. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, 3 o'clock Pacific Standard. I think, you know what? I want to do some highlights at the end of these to show like what was the cool part of this cast. And I think this stuff we did all yesterday. I think the cool thing about this one was we did a little bit of, this is really like UX stuff. The stuff that we focused on was we basically do a check if it's a blur event or an input event, and we use a little bit of these data attributes to enable or disable showing the validation errors, right? So we don't want to show them right away when a user first starts typing into a form because that would just be like noisy. But we also don't want to necessarily wait all the way until the blur event. However, because the submit event, because the submit event is when the default validation happens, we do still want to include that validation logic during the submit event if the form is invalid. I'd say that's the recap for the day. So thanks again for hanging out. It looks like we had a few more viewers today, which is cool. And yeah, if you enjoyed the show, really appreciate if you follow the channel, share it with people, let people know it's cool, and keep coming back. Come back with your questions too. Happy to answer those or take a look at whatever projects you're working on. Oh, web dev journey. I did do some looking into the title attribute today because I know that I had some thoughts about that in terms of accessibility. And what I came up with what I discovered was that while the title attribute does technically work for some accessibility scenarios, like we looked at yesterday with when you add a title to an element, let's see, like this input is title equals YOLO. When we do that, we can see that when I hover over it, I see that sort of YOLO. And when I inspect that element and look at the accessibility tree, well, this input already has a label, but if it didn't, we could see that it in the accessibility tree, it's labeled as YOLO. That's actually not the case for a lot of assistive technology. So I think the consensus is that the title attribute should not be used in place of other types of labels. So for inputs, you want to use the label element. For buttons, you want to use probably either an ARIA label or content. Even so, ARIA labels don't work for everything. So yeah, like visibly hidden content is the best. But there's another feature is that yesterday we discussed how using the title is a little bit of a user experience improvement because as I hover over it, I'm actually seeing content that could be helpful to the context that I'm looking at. I think let's do a better example here. Let's not do, oops. Let's not do that. We had an example like this where it was like title equals submit, right? So looking at this button, I don't know by looking at it what it does. But if I hover over it, I do see that submit. So it's kind of a nice feature for desktop users. However, that information is critical information and is only available to desktop users using a mouse. So for users that are using a keyboard, for example, when I get there, I don't necessarily know what this button does. And some assistive technology will tell me that this is a button that's called submit because of the title, but not everything will. So I'm just trying to make the point that for very critical information, you don't want to hide it from anyone, right? So that's going to be assistive technology users, also users that are on devices that don't use a mouse. So phones, for example, can't hover. Well, you can kind of hover, but not really. So what you might want to do instead is use content that's actually in the DOM and have like a little tooltip that when I hover over it with the mouse, it'll like pop up and show that. Or when the element receives focus is another good way that, in this case, theoretically, we'd have a tooltip that pops up as that button receives focus. And that way keyboard users would also have access to that content. Not to mention assistive technology users. So I hope that was helpful information. Accessibility is hard, and it's hard to do those UI features, like even little tooltips are kind of difficult to do. So yeah, and you say, I feel like designers would have a lot of trouble with this. Yeah, well, I think if the design doesn't show content, then it's fair game for developers to implement a tooltip because we know that accessibility is important. It's also something where you can have an open discussion with your designers and say, hey, this is not great for accessibility. And then even things like just cognitive issues with looking at UIs. I know a lot of designers like to do sexy, low profile designs that have, don't say anything at all. But a lot of studies have showed that it's actually better for users to see the text label and see the description and have more information. So, make your own decisions, but putting more information out there and making it obvious makes it easier for users. So hope that's helpful. Yeah, that's the end of the stream. And again, I'll be back on tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard. Bring your questions. Otherwise, watch me flop around with some HTML and some JavaScript. And eventually we'll get to CSS because I like CSS too. All right. See ya.